Hi everyone, Talia from Zart Art. Today we're going to be creating a alcohol ink landscape on bleed-proof paper. So what we're going to be using is a sheet of bleed-proof paper. So we've just cut this one down to an in-between an A4 and an A5 size. So you don't want to go too big with what you're creating because you'll be using the alcohol inks, and the smaller surface you use it on, the more ink you'll save, which can be a bit more cost effective if you are doing this for a whole class. So the bleed-proof paper is here. We've got small bottles of alcohol ink. These bottles are really handy to have because they have a nozzle on the top, which will help us control the amount of ink that will come out, as well as spreading it across the page. So instead of having to use a brush where you might see the fine lines coming through the ink, you can disperse it directly from the nozzle so you get smooth blending lines as you put it on the paper. We also have our other colours here. So we've got silvers as well as a gold included in this packet, and an extender which will help us to blend the colours together a bit more. And we've got a dip pen. So a lot of people would use something like this for calligraphy work, but with this we'll use it with the alcohol inks to create some finer details when we're finishing our work. So we're going to be using bleed-proof paper for this. Some people use UPO paper or even plastic when applying alcohol inks. The reason that we'll be using bleed-proof is because it will allow the inks to dry a bit faster than what they would on UPO or plastic. It's still semi-absorbent, so we'll have a bit of time to work with the ink before it sinks in. But this is also really handy for something like Copic markers because it doesn't absorb all the ink quickly or fully. It will keep it on the surface to work with, and you'll have a bit of a shine, a bit more matte than a UPO is, but you'll still get that really nice color blending. It's also really cheap if you have a lot of kids to work with and you don't want to spend too much money on the surface that you're working on. So for our landscape, it's going to be quite simple, but we'll be working in a few different layers. So what I'm going to do is start with our background layer, which will be a bit of a sunset. So what you could do with the kids is have a reference image that they can work from, whether that's a photograph or even a watercolor painting. But I'm just going to stick to some really simple mountains and some trees in the foreground. So I don't really need a reference image to work from. So I'm just going to start with my lightest colors first. So we've got our yellow here. You can use the nozzle to drag across the page, and you don't need to use too much ink as you drag across. But what you can do is also use a brush. So I'll just dry this one off. So if you want to spread the ink a bit more, and as you can see, that does dry pretty quickly on the bleed-proof paper, which is good because that will help us to build up our layers. But you can directly apply and then brush over. So I'm not too worried about having those brush strokes on the paper because I'm going to put more colors and more layers over the top. So this is just my base color, and it's always good to work from lightest color to darkest color. Okay, so I've got a bit of yellow on my page, and now I'll move to a slightly darker color. So I've got my orange, and I'll drag that across, and as you can see, that orange is blending really nicely into that yellow already. And I'll just do another layer working upwards, and we'll go darker and darker as we bring it across, and then from there we'll use our dark colors and blend back into those light colors. So it's all about building layers, and this paper is great for building those layers because you don't have to wait for drying time. So it's always nice to work wet on wet, just because when you're applying the ink over the top, it spreads and will blend a bit nicer than working on a completely dry layer. What you can also do is use the extender. So this is just a clear alcohol ink, and that will kind of rejuvenate the ink underneath. So instead of it being completely dry and unworkable, this will bring it back so you can blend a little bit more into it. Okay, so now we're going to get to our darker colours, and what you'll notice with some colours in the alcohol ink range is that they are very, very dark. So colours like this purple, you'll put in a drop and you'll think that looks nearly black. So when you are working with these dark colours, it's always good to spread it out with a brush, so then you get those purple tones that are much more noticeable than if the ink was sitting in one big blob. Also using the extender with the dark colours will help spread it out a bit, so then you'll get more of those purple tones coming through. When you are using alcohol inks with the brush, you might want to use something that's alcohol based to completely clean them off. But if you do wipe away most of the ink onto a tissue or wet cloth, or do have some water beside you, you can get most of the ink out without having to use anything special to clean off your brushes. They may stain, but that won't impact how they are used the next time you're working with them. Okay, so now I've got my base colours down. What I'm going to do is start blending these lighter colours back up so that we'll have a bit more blending going on between each layer, so it doesn't look like they're all in separate pieces. So now I'm going to let that dry for about a minute or two. It's not going to take too long at all, but I have put quite a bit of ink over the top of those layers that were already drying. So I'm just going to let that dry off a bit more before I do the foreground, and then we'll also be working on the middle ground in the next section as well. So now I'm going to use some of this silver alcohol ink just to resemble stars in the sky. These pearlescent inks work really well, especially on the bleed-proof paper, because it is slightly more absorbent than something like a Yupo. These shiny inks really stand out and will work really lovely against the blending. So all I'm going to do is give this a bit of a shake, just because those silver pigments will settle to the bottom. So just make sure they're mixed in well, and then just on a small brush, I'll apply it directly to the brush because I don't want a giant blob of silver everywhere. So I just add little bits here and there, and then use the extender over the top. They'll spread out a little bit more when I use the brush with it. So you can see that's activated some of the color from underneath, and it's bringing it across. So just using the brush to manipulate it, we can spread that along. And then it brings out some really nice blending underneath from all the colors that we have from those previous layers. And it works especially well on those darker purples and the blacks. And it could even look like maybe cloud formations in the sunset, but we've got some really interesting movement happening with some of that silver and the other colors. Now we've just added a touch of silver in the sky just to bring out the black a little bit more so it's not so overpowering. And then over that we're just going to make a moon just to draw a focal point and to break up that sky. So I'm going to be using the white for this. So the other colors can be quite transparent. However, this white will be very, very opaque, and you can see it almost looks like an acrylic paint when you're putting it over the top of those other colors. I'll just clean off this brush because the other colors will blend into that white quite easily. And you can see those colors are also blending from the bottom, which is fine. I'm just going to spread it with the brush and then add more white over the top of that and maybe a bit of silver, just to draw your eye to that one point in the sky. But even the colors blending in look quite nice, and you can see the definition from the white in there as well. what you'll notice with the alcohol inks is they're not the easiest thing to control. They kind of have a life of their own and they'll spread where they want to spread. You can try and use a brush to guide the direction of where it's flowing, but I quite like the abstractness of this, and you're never going to get anything that's super realistic by working in an ink that is so flowing, which is nice in itself. I mean, we don't want to get anything that is hyper realistic in this. It's more exploring the ink and seeing how it works on the paper. Okay, now we're going to work on the foreground. So this will just be some grassy mountains. So what we're going to do is work in a few different layers and tones of green. So we've got our green alcohol ink, which again is quite dark. So when you drop it in one spot, you'll notice that it almost does look like a black. So I'll be using the brush to help spread it out. We'll also be using the extender to create some lighter tones, and the yellow as well, just to get some variance in that grass. So what I'm going to do is just spread out this green ink like we did with the sky. I'm just trying to get a base layer down, and then I can work on those other tones and then blending them all together. And as you can see, the green is quite dark when you let it sit in one spot, but as you spread it out, you can see there is a nice emerald green that comes out. Now what I want to try and avoid is that obvious line where you can see I've dragged the bottle across and then spread the ink out. So you can either go over it again to make a darker green or use the extender to help spread that ink a little bit more if you do want some lighter tones in there. Now I'll add some yellow, and this might look quite weird just going straight on compared to the green, but don't worry too much. Like I said, I'm just getting down some layers to blend the colors into each other. And now we've finished the foreground layer, and you can see there's some different tones of green merging together. We're just going to let that dry for a few minutes again before we work on the trees that will be sitting in the foreground. So we're going to do those as if they were silhouettes with our dip pen, and we'll be using the black alcohol ink for that to get the contrast between each of the layers. So I'm just going to let that dry until it's not too tacky, and then we'll work over the top. Okay, now we've got our layer of foreground nice and dry, so we can work over the top of that using our dip pen. And I've just got this really small lid that I'm going to use to put the ink in. So using the ink straight out of the bottle with the nozzle isn't going to work so well to get the finer details, because the ink will just spread and you'll get really, really thick lines that just move any way that they want to. So using the dip pen, small amount of ink in the lid, the smaller the bottle or the smaller the lid you can get, the better, just because you need the ink to be at least, I'm going to say 2 centimeters, enough for the dip pen to actually get in there and take some of the ink in. So working over the top of these layers, you can see the line as I draw down is getting thinner the less ink is in the pen. So we want a thicker trunk for this tree, and then we can do some thin branches at the top. So just by adjusting your pressure, you can really gauge how much of the ink will flow through. So don't be too heavy-handed, just do quite light strokes and then you'll get some thinner lines. Now we've finished the foreground with the trees using the dip pen. So as you can probably notice, the dip pen works quite well to create some fine lines, and you can really gauge how much ink you want to come out of it by the amount of pressure that you put into it. It might take a few goes to get used to it, especially if you're doing this with kids, so you might just want to have a spare piece of paper so they can get a bit of a feel of how the pen works. And you can get different nibs as well. So this one's quite a fine nib, but you can get square ones, thicker ones, ones that are quite broad. But if you are just using this for the first time and you don't want to buy a class set of different tips, then ones that are quite fine are good to work with, because you can just make your lines thicker by going over and over the same area again. So now we've finished our piece, and as you can see, it's got quite a nice shine to it, even though the Bleedproof paper is a bit more matte than other papers you would usually use with the inks. But this is a nice cheaper way of going about using alcohol inks, especially if you're doing some experiments. You can use the Bleedproof paper without having to worry about throwing it away because of mistakes or using too much of it. So it is a really good alternative for something like this. So that's all for this week. Don't forget to check out our other videos, and we look forward to seeing you again soon.